It's great to have all of you here. It feels sort of appropriate that I've come I've come gaily to this. I've come gaily to this from an event at the Lydd House that honored the late Professor Bennett Lamond, who was an amazing pioneer of being an out, proud, brave gay man going back to when he started teaching at Washington College in, I think, 1965 or 66, and was just a beacon to those of us who arrived later on, generations later, as gay faculty members trying to make our own place here. And so we owe so much to the generations who came before us. We can learn so much from them, and so I'm so glad that we have a chance tonight and this semester to honor one of them in particular. In fact, two of them, because David Carter himself was and is a pioneering activist. So I'm thrilled to welcome David Carter during our fall semester as the Patrick Henry Writing Fellow. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Patrick Henry Writing Fellowship brings to Washington College, either for a semester or for a year, somebody who is working on an important project, usually a book, about the history and legacy of America's founding ideas. It was started by the Nuttall family, who are the descendants, direct descendants of Patrick Henry, whom they fondly revere. And I would like to thank the members of the Nuttall family, who unfortunately can't be here with us this evening, as well as to thank the members of the Faculty Selection Committee, Provost and Dean Emily Chamley Wright, my colleagues at the CV Starr Center, and at the O'Neill Literary House, which is the co-sponsor of this fellowship. So as I said, the Nuttall family endowed this fellowship 10 years ago in memory of their revolutionary ancestor. And many of the fellowship's past recipients, in fact, have been working on books about 18th century history, as some of you will recall. And indeed, some of you may be wondering, what in the world does a 1960s gay rights activist have to do with Patrick Henry? Big shrug. So I thought I would talk about that for a moment. I was actually a little bit concerned. It was with some trepidation that I wrote to Margaret Nuttall Castellani, whose mother endowed this fellowship, and told her about our visiting fellow this fall. I wasn't quite sure what the family would make of this and how she would react. And safe to say, Margaret Nuttall's mother, who's been dead for a number of years, would not have expected such a choice, to put it delicately. So when I got an email back from her daughter, the header of the email said, "Things Patrick Henry," and this is in all caps, "never addressed." Okay, what's this going to be about? So I opened the email, and in fact, this is what she had written. She wrote, "I am delighted." And what she was delighted about was the way that this fellowship, as she said, was making Patrick Henry relevant again in the public conversation. She also said relevant beyond those Tea Party jerks. So she really felt like this was bringing him into the conversation, and it was honoring somebody, Franklin Kameny, whom we're about to hear about, who was very much an American revolutionary in the mold of Patrick Henry, and who, as I'm sure David will tell us, very consciously associated himself and made references to the revolutionary movement of the 18th century throughout his life as an activist. In fact, I'm sure that if Patrick Henry hadn't gotten to the phrase, "give me liberty or give me death," Frank Kameny probably would have used it as his rallying cry. To introduce David Carter, David grew up in Jessup, Georgia, not a hotbed of gay activism in the 1950s and 60s, I would assume. And he later, fortunately, made it to Emory University and the University of Wisconsin, although I know you're still a proud son of Georgia. And in Wisconsin, he was drawn into the burgeoning gay civil rights movement, gay and lesbian civil rights movement at that point, first as an activist and then as a writer. His history of the Stonewall riots was published 10 years ago, which, even though it was only a decade ago, it seems to many of us like the blink of an eye, was really another time in terms of the understanding and public embrace of LGBT people. It felt at that point like LGBT history was this sort of minor footnote or piece of marginalia. In fact, when Tom Brokaw published this mammoth 700-page volume on the legacies in American society and life of the 1960s, he mentioned the gay rights movement in exactly one sentence. So this is what historians like David Carter have been working against or working to change. That book, incidentally, is over for sale here, and David will be glad to sign it after the lecture. And for Washington College students, the book is half price. So how much is it, Shannon? $9. Wow, amazing. Okay, it's worth much more than that. So the book was widely hailed. Publishers Weekly called it nothing less than, quote, a permanent addition to the great histories of the civil rights era. Wow. I'm especially delighted that David is here with us this semester because he's quickly become a generous and energetic contributor to this community and member of this college community. He actually put out the call, we put out the call at the start of the semester that we would welcome a student to work with David as a researcher on his book project. And, you know, we expected, I don't know, maybe somebody would apply, maybe not. In the past, there tended to be, you know, often somewhat lukewarm interest in LGBT history at the college. Well, we had a relative flood of students that we didn't really know what to do with. So David basically said, well, let me work with all of them. So he's got a whole cohort this semester of student researchers he's going to be working with closely, some of whom are here today. On November 21st and 22nd, just to give a further promo before David steps up here, he's doing a sort of a 2-day like festival of Allen Ginsberg in partnership with James Hall at the Lit House. They're screening a classic documentary from the 50s, and then they're also, David is bringing his friend Bob Rosenberg, who was a great friend of Allen Ginsberg and also Ginsberg's literary executor, and they're going to talk, and David himself worked very closely with Ginsberg, editing a collection of interviews with Ginsberg that was published about 15 years ago or so, right? And finally, I should mention that David, together with my colleague Pat Nugent, the deputy director at the Starr Center, they're going to be leading a weekend road trip to New York, November 12th, and that trip is going to be to explore gay rights history in New York around the Stonewall area and around Lower Manhattan, and that is free to any student. Well, I think it's going to be free or almost free. Haven't quite worked that out yet to any student who wants to come. It's an overnight trip to New York. It's going to be really exciting to have David leading us as a guide there. So if you're interested, please talk to me or Pat Nugent or David or any of our colleagues. Anyway, without further ado, David, it's such a privilege and a joy to welcome you to Washington College and welcome you here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Adam, for that most warm welcome. I really appreciate it. It's really been a pleasure being here for the my first 3 weeks here, and I've been made by all of you to feel very welcome. I thank you very much for that. I especially want to thank those at the CV Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience I've been working with so far. Adam Goodhart, you just heard, Gene Wortman, Patrick Nugent, Michael Buckley, and Jennifer Emily. Reminds me, I recently gave a tour of the Stonewall area to George Takei, so I was wondering, is this my beam me up Scotty moment? And I also want to thank Jennifer Emily, as well as James Hall of the Rose O'Neill Literary House. And I'd like to thank the Provost, Emily Chamley Wright, for her support of the Starr Center. And I also have enjoyed starting to work with the student researchers. Adam was just mentioning who will be working with me this semester. Caroline Harvey, Clemmerly Lifton, Jessica Steves, and Juliet Kazmerzik. I especially want to mention my partner in crime and colleague, Eric Danzer, who came down initially from New York City to help me move in, and more importantly has been my collegial friend in gay history work, particularly Stonewall and Franklin Kameny. I was telling Pat today that Eric certainly has earned a doctorate in Stonewall studies. I'm especially honored to speak to all of you tonight, having had the wonderful fortune of being the recipient of a Patrick Henry Fellowship through the CV Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience. for this is the greatest honor I've had as a writer. The fellowship is not only an honor, however, but is also a very practical godsend, because until this past year, I worked on the biography of Dr. Franklin Kameny piecemeal. Since my work on Kamany's life has been done entirely on my own time and almost 100% self-financed. And I can tell you, trying to do this kind of things evenings and weekends when there's been a slew of Stonewall historical commemorative projects has kept my, I've been 11 years and I'm kind of where I thought it'd be after 2 years. So it does mean a great deal to me. As the interest on the part of the general public in LGBT civil rights history is relatively new, I thought I should say a word about terminology before launching into the speech. Today the trend is to say LGBT or queer when talking about this history. But these terms are rather recent and are not the terms that historians use to talk about most of the period we will be reviewing tonight. So let me say that when I'm using other terms that sometimes may be seen as somewhat or largely problematic or even negative today, that I'm not using those terms out of a lack of sensitivity, but rather because these are the terms that are generally used by historians, and also out of a desire not to be anachronistic. To give but one example, when the word gay began to be used widely by the movement instead of homosexual after the Stonewall Uprising, the word was generally and almost universally understood at that time to apply both to homosexual men and women. And there's one example that I'm sure very few of you in the audience will have heard, so I will introduce and define it now, and that is the term homophile. This is the term that the movement before Stonewall used to describe itself. While this term may sound quaint or peculiar to contemporary ears, as no doubt our current terminology will sound to people 40 or 50 years from now, this word was created by the movement for homosexuals in the 1950s and 1960s for two main reasons. First, to combat the prevalent conception which mitigated against the idea of homosexual rights, that homosexuals were primarily beings who were obsessed by sex. Second, there have long been non-LGBT supporters of this movement, and there was a desire to have a word that could be applied to allies while still being accurate. This was the reason that the Greek-based word was coined, to give an emphasis to love, philia, and to undercut the idea that homosexuals were more interested in lust and less interested in romance and true love than heterosexuals. Now let us take a short trip back in time to a social and political reality that has now mostly vanished, a time when the oldest ones among us tonight were probably children or teenagers at the most, a time around 4.5 decades before the students who are in this audience tonight were born, the years between 1945 and 1961. I'm saying this so that I'm giving this background information so that when we get to Frank Kameny, you can see what a contribution he made, what a radical departure his approach was to what had gone before, what a fresh voice in the wilderness. Homosexual acts have been outlawed in this country since colonial days because of the heritage of English law. Homosexuality remained generally condemned and was socially disapproved after the newly independent United States liberalized some of the harshest colonial laws that addressed what was in termed sodomy by, for example, ending the death penalty for such acts in some states. Yet, while the topic of what would come to be called homosexuality was either condemned or forced into the shadows from the revolutionary era right up through the 1960s, history shows us that the worst times for the homosexual men and women in the United States were not during the earliest days of our nation, nor in its middle era, but rather the post-World War II era. That is to say, that era comprising the mid to late 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s, was both the time when there was the greatest effort to enforce laws that punished homosexual conduct and to enact new laws that increased the punishments for homosexual acts, as well as to create a pervasive social climate that demonized homosexual men and women. To give you a feeling for the tone of the anti-homosexual writing of the period, here is an excerpt from Coronet magazine, a very mainstream periodical from the year 1950. The homosexual is an inveterate seducer of the youth of both sexes and is not content with being degenerate himself. He must have degenerate companions and is ever seeking younger victims. Some male sex deviants do not stop with infecting their often innocent partners with homosexuality. They descend through perversions to other forms of depravity, such as drug addiction, burglary, sadism, and even murder. Once a man assumes the role of homosexual, he throws off all moral restraints. Now, it is easy to groan and laugh at such unfair and unreal characterizations today, but let us take a moment to imagine what it was like to live in a society if one was homosexual or bisexual, when this was the mainstream view of same-sex love. Living under the miasma of so much hate and knowing that the vitriol that such hatred could generate could be, and almost assuredly would be, aimed at oneself if one's family, friends, co-workers, or neighbors knew or suspected that one had tender or erotic feelings for members of one's own sex, put so much pressure on gay people of the period that many did not act on their feelings in a natural way and had to live double lives. It was even worse for those lesbians and gay men who internalized those negative attributes to such an extent that they tried to deny their feelings and fell victim to depression and neurotic behavior, leading unfulfilling lives while blaming themselves, and in the saddest cases, ending up going insane or committing suicide. Why did things become so bad for American homosexuals after the Second World War? Given the increasing shrillness of both the far right after World War II, exemplified by a rabid anti-communism, and the demand for total conformity that characterized the 1950s, laws aimed at homosexuals became so harsh that at times they were draconian. The Defense Department hardened its policies of excluding homosexual servicemen and women, tripling the World War II discharge rate, and, in a reversal of prior practice, generally giving less than honorable blue discharges. These punitive discharges stripped thousands of veterans of the benefits they had been promised in the GI Bill of Rights. After Lieutenant Roy Blick of the Washington, D.C. Vice Squad testified before the Senate in 1950 that 5,000 homosexuals worked for the government, a figure he had totally made up, the Senate authorized a full investigation into the matter by a subcommittee chaired by North Carolina Senator Clyde Hoy. Maybe things don't change too much in North Carolina. The Hoy subcommittee's report said that those who engage in overt acts of perversion lack the emotional stability of normal persons. Having concluded that one homosexual can pollute an entire office, the subcommittee urged that the military's recent purge of homosexuals be the model for civilian agencies. The Civil Service Commission and the FBI happily complied by initiating an intense campaign to ferret out homosexuals by, for instance, correlating Marl's arrest across the United States with lists of government employees and checking fingerprints of job applicants against the FBI's fingerprint files. I should also note, these were people who had merely been arrested, not only those who had been convicted. So if you were simply arrested and charged with this kind of act or crime, you were on that list, and this information was passed on to employers as if you'd been convicted of that crime, if it was a crime. While McCarthyism encouraged the toughening of laws toward homosexuals because they were believed to be security risk, Americans' Puritan tradition was producing hysteria over child molestation. Homosexuals were believed to be the main culprits. As the right-wing demonization proceeded apace, the negative qualities attributed to homosexuals overlapped until it became a common assumption that any man or woman who was homosexual was so far beyond the pale that they must also partake of the most forbidden ideological fruit of all, communism. Homosexuals thus became handy scapegoats for both of these post-war preoccupations. anti-homosexual laws were correspondingly made more severe. And I just want to insert here that my colleague, Dr. David Johnson, who's one of the people who's written most about Dr. Kameny, his book, The Lavender Scare, is called The Lavender Scare because he proved for the first time that there were many more people fired from the federal government for being homosexual or suspected of being homosexual. By far more were fired for that reason than for being communist or communist sympathizers. So I'm not just making this up about the conflation, the way the two overlapped and were pervasive fixation on the part of the public and the government. States passed new laws either stiffening the penalties for homosexual sex or creating new categories to criminalize. California Governor Earl Warren, for example, thought the sex offender problem so serious that in 1949 he convened a special session of the state legislature just to deal with the issue. That session passed laws that increased the penalties for sodomy and invented a new crime, loitering in a public toilet. The name of anyone convicted of spending too much time in a toilet was registered with the state. 29 states enacted new sexual psychopath laws and/or revised existing ones, and homosexuals were commonly the law's primary targets. In almost all states, professional licenses could be revoked or denied on the basis of homosexuality so that professionals could lose their livelihoods. Actually, I remember Randy Wicker, one of the early gay activists, telling me the story that he went out one time with a lawyer who was representing the Mattachine Society in New York, and the lawyer was gay, and they wanted to stop at a newsstand and look at a gay magazine, and the lawyer just looked at it and put it back down, and he was like reading it, and Randy says, "Well, don't you want to buy it?" And he says, "No, I'm afraid as a lawyer, I can't be seen buying this. I could be disbarred." Again, this I think gives you a glimpse into the atmosphere of the time. By 1961, the laws in America were harsher on homosexuals than those in Cuba, Russia, or East Germany. An adult convicted of the crime of having sex with another consenting adult in the privacy of his or her home could get anywhere from a light fine to 5, 10, 20 years, or even life in prison. In 1971, 20 states had sex psychopath laws that permitted them to detain homosexuals. In Pennsylvania and California, sex offenders could be locked in a mental institution for life. And in 7 states, they could be castrated. At California's Atascadero State Hospital, it was soon called Dachau for Queers after it opened, men convicted of consensual sodomy were, as authorized by 1941 law, given electrical and pharmacological shock therapy, castrated, and lobotomized. Gay law author William Eskridge, Jr. summed up the legal status of homosexuals at the beginning of the 1960s. The homosexual was smothered by law. It has often been pointed out that no specific statute outlawed being homosexual, that only homosexual acts were illegal. While this is technically true, the effect of the entire body of laws and policies that the state employed to police the conduct of homosexual men and women was to make being gay a crime de facto. The very harshness of the laws made judges generally unwilling to sentence homosexual men, lesbians, and transvestites to such inhumane sentences. So instead, judges tended to hand out light fines or to place those convicted on probation. But the random or selective use of far harsher penalties and the potential threat of their use, combined with other sanctions and harassments, major and minor, official and non-official, were more than sufficient to keep the vast majority of homosexual men and women well within the lines that society had drawn for them. Thus, lesbians and homosexuals lived in an uneasy state of fear and spiritual suffocation. Having created all manner of sanctions to make it difficult for homosexual men and women to meet their own kind, the police aggressively patrolled the few places where homosexuals could mingle: bars and bathhouses, both private and public, and outdoor cruising places such as streets, parks, and beaches. Jurisdictions planted microphones in park benches and used peepholes and two-way mirrors to spy on homosexuals in public restrooms. While the law classified homosexuals as criminals and the scientific establishment used psychology to medicalize homosexuality into an illness, gay men and lesbians found almost universal moral condemnation from religions, whether mainstream or obscure. Thrice condemned as criminals, as mentally ill, and as sinners, homosexuals faced a social reality in post-World War II America that was bleak, if not grim. Throughout much of American history, lesbians, homosexuals, and transvestites at times offered resistance, however weak, fleeting, or ineffectual, to the social and legal institutions that oppressed them. But the first sustained political resistance began with the founding of the Mattachine Society in Los Angeles by Harry Hay in 1950 and 1951. This began the homophile movement. The vision that Hay and his colleagues articulated in a statement of purpose was to unify homosexuals who were isolated from their own kind. Second, to educate them in order to develop an ethical homosexual culture similar to that of other minorities. And after progress had been made toward the first two goals, to push forward into the realm of political action. In other words, they felt that the situation of gay men and women was so abysmal that they needed to first do a little propping up and education to prepare them for political action. They would not be ready then. The Mattachine Society, which took its name from medieval societies in which those playing the role of fool could speak truth to those in power, was spurred into political action sooner, however, than planned, when one of its founders was entrapped by a police officer. The Mattachine Society resolved to fight the charge, a radical idea at the time. Astonishingly, Mattachine won, making their name renowned among California homosexuals and spurring a membership surge. Not long afterwards, however, word began to circulate of the radical politics of some of the society's founders, notably Hay, who was a member of the Communist Party. When it became clear that the organization would falter if Hay did not withdraw from it, he did so at the Mattachine Society's 1953 National Convention. The organization then incorporated as an educational and research group, espousing the belief that by providing accurate information about homosexuality to the public, it could, quote, eliminate discrimination, derision, prejudice, and bigotry. What this meant in practice was that given both the extreme shrillness and the predominance of the anti-communist ideology of the Red Scare that dominated the 1950s and extended into the 1960s, and the way we have seen that homosexuality was conflated with communism, the homophile movement saw homosexuals as having no credibility in the public arena. This was also the time of the ascendance and triumph of psychology and psychoanalysis in the United States. While homosexuality had had a significant place in Freud's psychology, America, the first country to embrace Freud's work wholeheartedly, also twisted the relatively mildly negative view of Freud that homosexuality was a failure to achieve optimal psychological maturity into the view that homosexuality was a very serious pathology. Given the coincidence of the ascendance of psychology and homosexuality, given the coincidence of the ascendance of psychology and homosexuality having reached a social nadir, a time when gay men and women not only could potentially be locked up in jails and thrown out of jobs, but occurring at a time when this was happening with the greatest frequency in our nation's history, it is understandable that the homophile movement felt that homosexuals had no credibility, and that the best strategy was to cooperate with psychologists and psychiatrists in their studies of homosexuals. It seemed far better to support those who said homosexuals were mentally ill and giving understanding and therapy could be changed, as opposed to those who felt homosexuals should be deprived of their jobs and placed in prison cells. The extent to which the homophile movement embraced the research and education approach was practically total. The homophile movement reached its nadir in March of 1961, when its most prominent official leader, Hal Call, the president of the Mattachine Society, dissolved the National Mattachine Society via the National Mattachine's board of directors, severing legal ties with its local chapters. And they even requested that local chapters take the word Mattachine out of their name. A total retreat. Now that we have some context, we can look at Frank Kameny and how he enters into this history. We saw earlier how federal and state agencies worked with each other to share information on persons who might be suspected or who were known to be homosexual, so that those persons could be fired from jobs deemed too sensitive to trust to employees judged to be security risk, as in fact all homosexuals were considered. It was a reversal of what the public was always told was a key and cherished American value, that one is innocent until proven guilty. Now, just who was Frank Kameny? In 1957, Franklin E. Kameny was a brilliant young man of Jewish descent, born in New York City, who had known from a very tender age that what he most wanted to be was an astronomer. He had taken all the science courses he could in high school and had started college, but his studies were interrupted by World War II. He was drafted and called into active duty in September of 1943. He was trained to fire a mortar, assigned to the 58th Armored Infantry Battalion, and shipped off to England in November of 1944. On January 1st, 1945, he sailed for France, where his unit was assigned to fight in the Battle of the Bulge. Fortunately, that terrible battle ended before Frank's unit arrived there, so he ended up fighting in Holland and then Germany, seeing frontline action and taking prisoners. As Kameny would recall, he was halfway across Germany when the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Excuse me. After returning home with several medals, Kameny resumed his college studies, graduating with a BS in physics with honors from Queens College. He then enrolled in Harvard University, from which he would earn his master's and PhD degrees. As for Frank's sexuality, he was what is termed in the gay male world a late bloomer. He had had a few homosexual experiences in his youth and apparently only one homosexual experience while he was in the Army. And given the prevalent belief system at the time influenced by Freudian orthodoxy, Kameny assumed that the homosexual behavior was something he would grow out of. This seemed to work for him until his 29th birthday in 1954. When performing research for his PhD at an observatory in Tucson, Arizona, he met a young man who was more sexually experienced than him, and in Frank's words, the youth seduced him. During what Frank called a golden summer, Frank was shown around the gay community in Arizona by the younger man, went to a homosexual bar for the first time, and heard the word gay for the first time. In short, he came out and took to his new life as a duck to water. But as we have seen, this was also the time when police surveillance of homosexuals was on the rise. And when Frank attended an astronomy conference in San Francisco, he was arrested by plainclothes police officers in a men's restroom at a bus station after a man standing next to him came on to Frank, and Frank responded. Told by the police that if he pled guilty, the matter would be quickly disposed of, and that if he had a clean record 6 months later, the charge would be expunged. Kameny pled guilty to lewd and indecent acts and paid a fine of $50. After receiving his PhD from Harvard in 1956, Kameny moved to Washington, D.C., and was hired by the Army Map Service, where he used his astronomical skills to help the military make more accurate maps. That fall, he was sent to Hawaii to use an observatory there. But not long after he arrived in Hawaii, as Frank recalled, I got a phone call from my top supervisor at the Army Map Service saying, "Something has come up. Come back right away." When Kameny returned to Washington, D.C. in November, he was confronted by Civil Service Commission, I'll be referring to them as the CSC, investigators about whether he was homosexual, based upon the supposedly expunged arrest record from San Francisco, for Kameny had completed the probationary period with no subsequent arrest nor accusations. There is a great irony in the timing of Kameny's being questioned and ultimately fired by the CSC at this time, for the month before Kameny was questioned is the date that Russia launched Sputnik 1, igniting the space race, throwing the United States government into panic, and men with Kameni's credentials were far and few between. To Dr. Kameni's credit, he stoutly resisted the insane witch hunt he was subjected to from the very beginning, demanding to know the reason that he was suspected of being homosexual. When he was told that the investigators could not tell him what the evidence was, he replied, "Well, in that case, I can't answer you. And besides, it's irrelevant anyhow." By the 20th of December 1957, Kameni was formally fired. He hired a lawyer and began a series of legal appeals to get his job back, always meeting with failure. The case finally ended up at the stage where the last court of appeal was the United States Supreme Court. Kameni's attorney, who was working on a contingency fee basis, refused to represent Kameni further, saying there was no chance that the Supreme Court would agree to hear the case. But he did tell Frank that he could represent himself, explaining how a private citizen could submit a petition to the court asking it hear his case on its merits. And so Frank doggedly worked to craft the petition asking that his case be heard. Kameni said that having to write that petition forced him, for the first time, to sit down and think through all the issues that the government was raising about homosexuality and the implications of being homosexual. And so he crafted arguments that he hoped would convince enough justices on the nation's highest court to give him a hearing. And what a document he crafted. It is such a remarkable document that I consider it the most important political work written in the history of the LGBT civil rights movement. It is also so powerful and profound and so well written that I believe it deserves a place on our bookshelves in the literature of American freedom next to Thoreau's Civil Disobedience and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Why do I consider Kameni's 1961 petition to be so important? Primarily, it was the first time that anyone made the political argument that homosexuals were not merely a group of people that ought not to be persecuted, or who were harmless, or deserved therapy instead of being put in prison. But he argued instead that homosexuals were, first of all, a valid minority, and that, as such, they deserved full equality under the law with everyone else. In other words, homosexuality is on a par with heterosexuality. Indeed, he went much further than this and stated that not only should homosexuals be free from government harassment and persecution, but that the government should be actively defending homosexuals from harassment and persecution, just as the government defended persons singled out for discrimination on the basis of race or religion. Most astoundingly, he even stated to the 9 judges on the Supreme Court in 1961 that, quote, "Petitioner asserts flatly, unequivocally, and absolutely uncompromisingly that homosexuality, whether by mere inclination or by overt act, is not only not immoral, but that such acts are moral in a real and positive sense, and are good, right, and desirable, socially and personally." Frank is thought of as being far ahead of his time for a slogan he created in 1968 that essentially makes the same statement in 3 words. But I cannot understand his having not only that clarity of vision in 1961, but the courage to write those words, sticking those words directly under the noses of those 9 justices, 5 of whom he needed votes from to get a hearing to try to get his job back. And it was a job he very dearly wanted to get back. Norman Mailer has famously said that Allen Ginsberg was the most courageous man in America. But I think one can make a good case that Frank Kameni was Ginsberg's equal in courage. The petition is also extremely well written and brilliantly argued, with wonderful rhetorical flourishes and flashes of delightful wit, giving it literary merit. But the main reason that the petition is so historic, finally, is that Kameni then used the arguments and analyses he had arrived at in writing the petition as the guiding set of principles for the rest of his life. And by following and acting on those principles with great intelligence, integrity, great strategy, great tactics, without compromise, he transformed the movement by leading it from a quietist and apologetic approach into a militant movement, making possible a world of gains without which LGBT people would not be as near to achieving complete equality as we are today. Now, how did Frank Kameny accomplish this? It seemed clear to Kameny that having exhausted all legal appeals via the judicial system, that the only avenue to changing government policy was to work collectively instead of as an individual. That is, the time had come to organize. Late in 1961, Frank Kameny founded a political organization in Washington, D.C. to fight for equality for homosexuals. And I find it amazing that I said earlier, I thought the low point of the movement was when Hal Call tried to dissolve the national movement. That was I think that was the same month that, the same month that Frank Kameny's petition was rejected by the Supreme Court. He didn't get one vote out of the 9 judges. So it was the same month he decided, now I take. So I think that's really an amazing synchronicity, if you will, or image or symbol. Late in 1961, Frank Kameny founded a political organization in Washington, D.C. to fight for equality for homosexuals. In founding the organization, he wrote the Constitution to reflect his own political philosophy, as argued in his Supreme Court petition, that homosexuals deserve full and equal protection before the law and equal social status, and that this organization existed to be a direct action organization to realize those goals, the first time such an organization was created. And while some members, such as Jack Nichols, who helped found the new group, were quite ready for Kameny's radicalism, others were not. For example, it took Kameny and Nichols years to get his own organization to vote to take the official position that homosexuality is not a mental illness. That vote was not won until March of 1965, a little over 3 1/3 years after the organization's founding. But a remarkable thing about Frank's career as an activist is how quickly his radical vision took root and bore fruit. Clearly, the time had come for such a clarion call, for a number of people were either essentially at the point where Frank was, that is, they had been radicalized by the heavy government oppression, or they were at a place psychologically where they were ready and therefore able to hear his message, that equality was the only acceptable goal. Here is how Barbara Giddings, one of the most important lesbian pioneers in the movement, who had been in the movement for several years before she met Frank, explained the impact of Frank's thinking upon her. Well, before I met Frank, when I was active in the movement, I had a very inchoate idea of how we could solve our problems. I wanted to do something to address the problems that gay people had, but I didn't really know how to go about it. Frank came along and he had this very strong, very definite philosophy, and it crystallized my thinking. It jolted me and said, well, yes, of course, if you take the position that Frank has, the position that homosexuality is fully on par with heterosexuality and precisely equal to it, and that we are entitled to full rights, then you get a very clear view of what you have to do. And you don't have to fumble around anymore wondering, how are we going to solve these problems? And so Frank took one issue after another, applied his activist egalitarian logic to it, and went on to the next issue, always leading the Mattachine Society of Washington to demand equality, justifying his arguments with clear logic, and fighting for them with a tenacious courage. The list of Frank's accomplishments is astounding, and I can only touch upon some of them tonight. He played a pivotal role in getting the National American Civil Liberties Union to take up the cause of homosexual rights. Overall, as historian David Johnson wrote, he launched the first challenge to anti-gay policies adopted by the federal government during the McCarthy era, and was soon one of the few homosexuals in America willing to appear publicly and use his own name. Excuse me. In October of 1962, he broached the military issue when he and Mattachine Society member Bruce Scott met with a Pentagon official in charge of security clearances. In 1963, he approached the head of the Selective Service, General Hershey, about protecting the confidentiality of citizens who the Army questioned about their sexual orientation. He had the idea of forming the first regional organization of homophile organizations to coordinate strategies, ECHO, for the East Coast homophile organizations. In 1963, before his organization would take the stance, he issued his own personal statement taking on the American Psychiatric Association's classification of homosexuality as a mental illness. A key moment in Frank's career came in July of 1964 when he gave a talk in New York City entitled Civil Liberties, a Progress Report, probably the most important speech in the history of the movement. For in it, he took the arguments he had used in his Supreme Court petition and worked them into a resounding call to action. This time, not a printed piece for 9 justices to read in private, but a stem winder of a public speech that was a revolutionary call to action given to participants in the homophile movement. The speech galvanized militants such as Craig Rodwell and Randy Wicker and made militants of those who had not previously been militants, such as Julian Hodges, a leading light in the Mattachine Society, and Dick Leitch, who would become the next president of the Mattachine Society. In this speech, Kameny espoused a civil liberties social action emphasis for homophile groups as opposed to individual-centered social services and information education approaches. That's what he was opposing, and stating that the entire homophile movement is going to stand or fall upon the question of whether or not homosexuality is of sickness. He also said that the homophile movement must be built in a way that was analogous to the Black civil rights movement. In other words, it was time to end the education and research approach and to start emulating Black civil rights leaders like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Please note well that in this speech, we'll come back to this later, he particularly suggested that in New York City, the movement should emphasize ending police harassment of homosexuals and work on legalizing gay bars. After Kameny delivered the speech, the militants in the Mattachine Society of New York ran a slate for the next election in May 1965, and they threw out the entire old board that had practiced the education and research approach and voted in a board that agreed with Kameny's strategy, and Kameny was also elected a member of the board. As for the goal of making the movement more militant, the 2 most contentious issues in the homophile movement in the 1960s were whether the sickness theory should be challenged and whether homophiles should hold public demonstrations. Jack Nichols was the member who was most eager to hold public pickets. Frank agreed with Jack that they should picket, but Kameny thought that this was such a momentous move that they had to find exactly the right time and place and rationale for picketing. While Randy Wicker had organized a public picket of a draft center in New York City in 1964, this action did not lead to further pickets or energize or change the movement. But when Jack Nichols read that Fidel Castro was planning on putting homosexuals in concentration camps in Cuba, he went to Kameny with the idea of using this as a reason to picket. Kameny agreed, and 2 demonstrations were put together in short order, one on April 17, 1965 at the White House, and another protest the following day at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. These demonstrations had an electrifying effect on the participants, for they found this experience of declaring themselves and their cause in public greatly empowering. Therefore, more demonstrations were planned, eventually resulting in a whole series of pickets that year. When these demonstrations ended, Craig Rodwell, one of the New York City militants, was crestfallen, for he had been so energized by them. It was at that time that he had the inspiration of having a series of pickets annually in Philadelphia on July 4, on the anniversary of the time and at the place where the United States was born, to remind Americans that there was still one group of citizens who did not have their basic rights, for example, pursuit of happiness, as promised in the founding documents, and thus the annual reminder tradition was born. While all this public activity was occurring, Kameny and others were working steadily with challenges to the government's anti-gay security policies, military policies, and employment policies. And there were victories. Bruce Scott's case challenging the Civil Service Commission was won definitively in 1968 for him as an individual only. But that made a crack in the wall and showed that the CSC was not invincible. By 1968, there were enough new homophile organizations, inspired by the militancy instigated by Frank, that it seemed worthwhile to now have a national association as opposed to the earlier regional ECHO, Eastern area. And the North American Conference of Homophile Organizations, NACO, America's first national coalition of homosexual political organizations, held a conference in Chicago. And there they officially adopted "Gay is Good," a phrase that Frank coined as an official slogan for the homophile movement. Think how militant that sounded in 1968. Gay is good. By the way, this history ties into local history here. For Frank had been inspired to create that slogan when he saw a televised news report of "Black is Beautiful" being chanted by Stokely Carmichael as he led a civil rights demonstration for African Americans here on Maryland's Eastern Shore. All this activity percolating in the 1960s is evidence of a great sea change. Let us pause for just a moment to reflect on the distance already traveled from the education and research approach in 1961 to "Gay is Good" in 1968. Frank would go on to make many more changes in the following years. In 1971, he became the first openly gay person to run for national office when he ran for Congress to be the Washington, D.C.'s non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives. His single greatest contribution to the LGBT civil rights movement is that he led the fight that resulted in the American Psychiatric Association declassifying homosexuality as a mental illness in 1973. He also created the Leonard Matlovich case. Those of you who are a bit older in the room will probably remember that. Leonard Matlovich's face on the cover of Time magazine. The first time you had a gay person, openly gay person, on the cover of National magazine with a name. One historian wrote that signaled the beginning of the contemporary battle to overturn the U.S. military's policy barring lesbians and gays. In 1973, Frank co-founded and served on the first board of the National Gay Task Force, later renamed the National Lesbian and Gay Task Force, the nation's first truly national gay organization. He co-founded the Gay Rights National Lobby in 1975, which later became the Human Rights Campaign, for many years now the nation's most prominent national voice for LGBT civil rights. In 1977, during the presidency of Jimmy Carter, Frank Kameny participated in the historic first White House meeting with representatives of what was then called the Gay Rights Movement. While all of these activities were going on, Kameny continued to work and make progress on the issue of the rights of gay people to have security clearances and to serve in the military. And on July 3rd, the Civil Service Commission announced it was ending its policy that homosexuality was a bar to federal employment in response to a series of court decisions in cases that Frank Kameny had helped to create. Actually, before they made that public announcement, one of I think the top counsel it was at the CSC called Frank at home one night and said, the government has decided to change its policy to suit you. That's how much he was like a constant, bulldog on the government. Meanwhile, Kameny's run for Congress had inspired the creation of the Gay and Activist Alliance, GAA-DC, later renamed Gay and Lesbian Activist Alliance of DC, which since its birth in 1971 has remained one of the most effective LGBT organizations in the country and is now the longest-lived LGBT organization in America. GLAADC has so radically improved laws and policies in Washington, D.C. that our nation's capital is now considered the best city for LGBT people to live in. I would argue that this long list of accomplishments means that Frank Kameny is obviously one of the people who have contributed the most to the success of the LGBT civil rights movement in this country. Yet people often say that this movement has not had a clear leader in the vein of a Martin Luther King Jr. or a Rosa Parks, or if one wants to look to the founding fathers era for a parallel, Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin or James Madison or Patrick Henry. But I have to disagree with those who take this position, for I think Frank Kameny is that leading figure and deserves recognition as such. Now, the primary argument that I think has carried the most weight against Frank having such a preeminent role is that made by historian John D'Amelio, who has said that for all of Frank's contributions, he was not able to create a mass movement. It was Stonewall that did that, not Frank. I like John D'Amelio personally, and I respect him as one of the best historians of our movement. But on this point, I have to respectfully disagree with him, and I will explain why I differ with him on this issue. when I wrote the history of Stonewall, and I felt that finally, after many years, I had kind of all the pieces of information, and they all seemed to fit together and to make a whole picture. Still, it didn't seem to make sense. It was kind of like you completed a jigsaw puzzle, but the jigsaw puzzle somehow seemed upside down or oblique. The reason it puzzled me was, you remember earlier I said, please note that when Frank gave that speech in New York City, he urged the local New York movement to concentrate on ending police harassment of gay men and to legalize gay bars, and this is what they did. This happened under the Lindsay administration. Lindsay was a liberal Republican when we had such things as liberal Republicans. And the period before Lindsay had been a very harsh period in New York City for gay people. Routinely, all the bars were closed. Routinely, there were, sweeps of gay men to sweep them up on the street and so forth. And Dick Leitch, when he became president of the Mattachine Society of New York, inspired by Frank Kameny, he succeeded in getting the Lindsay administration to end the entrapment of gay people by the police department. And they made progress on the effort to legalize gay bars. They weren't there, but they were moving in that direction. Some of you have probably heard of the famous so-called sip-in at Julius Bar in New York City, where a group of homosexuals went from one bar to another saying, we're homosexual, we want to drink, and they finally got a bar to say no, so they could challenge this in court, the idea of it was okay to discriminate against gay people according to the liquor authority, the state liquor authority of New York. So what I couldn't understand when I looked at the history of Stonewall was, well, there's all this progress, and then you get an explosion. And I don't have a degree in history, and I mentioned this to a friend of mine who's the most well-read person I've ever known. And he says, well, David, historians have often noted that revolutions come after periods of liberalization. And when I thought of this, it made perfect sense. One's so oppressed, one can't have any hope. But then the oppression lets up enough that one can begin to dream of a full life. And that rang a bell, and I went back to an interview with Craig Rodwell. Craig Rodwell, I mentioned earlier before, the person who had the idea for the annual reminder. Craig Rodwell did so much for the gay movement, and he's particularly important for the history of Stonewall because he was the primary critic of the Stonewall Inn as a bar. When the Stonewall riots occurred, he was the main promoter, he was the main propagandist of the Stonewall riots, trying to get people to come and keep the thing going so it wouldn't be dismissed as a flash in the pan, and trying to get the media to cover it. And it was Craig who had the idea of stopping the annual reminder being in Philadelphia, moving it to New York City, moving it from July 4th to June 28th, the beginning of the Stonewall riots, which began the whole tradition of what we call gay pride celebrations around the world today. And Craig was there just about the time the riots began. And when he was interviewed by historian Michael Shurker, he was an oral historian, Michael Shurker asked Craig, well, was there anything in the weeks or months before Stonewall that made this happen? And Craig said, well, I don't think it was the weeks ahead of that, it was the years back. He said when the movement got going here and we had successes and we became more militant, particularly the Mattachine Society of Washington and the Mattachine Society of New York. And so that Craig Rodwell, who played such a critic of the bar, immediately saw the potential of the riots, worked hard to have the riots reach their potential and to nail it to the height of history by creating what was then called the Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade, Stonewall Inn being on Christopher Street. To have him point to that, because Craig Rodwell was also one of the main critics of Frank Kameny for being not quite militant enough or open enough that they had rather strict dress code for being in the picket lines. So that he gives to the Mattachine Society of Washington. And then he also got discouraged with the local Mattachine chapter because he wanted to open a bookstore. I know there's someone here who's a very big fan of bookstores. A friend of us all, Tom. So Craig felt that although the movement was getting more militant, it wasn't getting militant enough, fast enough for him. So that he gave the credit for the underlying cause of the Stonewall riots to the accomplishments of the often despised homophile movement of the 1960s. To me, that was kind of the proof that the analysis, typical or classic analysis of historians, was correct. So therefore, I think that without the gay militant movement, the gay liberation phase of the movement came out of Stonewall. And I don't think that's what swept around the world. That's what made the movement a mass movement, which John D'Amelio says was Frank's failing. That he didn't create a mass movement. Stonewall achieved this. But I think there were many things that happened to come together perfectly at Stonewall to make Stonewall happen. But I now feel that, clearly at the top of the list that made Stonewall happen was the militancy of the movement before Stonewall in the 1960s, led by Frank Kameny. So that's why I feel that Frank Kameny is the most important figure, really, from not only for the U.S. and not only for our day, but from the beginnings of the organized gay political movement in Germany in the late 19th century through today and worldwide. That's why I feel he is the most preeminent figure. And Dr. William Eskridge, our nation's most prominent authority on homosexuality in the law, said that Frank Kameny was the Rosa Parks, the Martin Luther King Jr., and the Thurgood Marshall of the LGBT civil rights movement because he served as its first protester, leader, and legal strategist. So no, the people who rose up against the police in Greenwich Village in June of 1969 may not have been reading militant homophile literature any more than the people who stormed the Bastille had perhaps not been reading Voltaire or Diderot. But that does not mean they were not influenced by them. As a great man once said, one cannot stop an idea whose time has come. Frank Kameny articulated the philosophy applying militant activism to homosexuals and lesbians, seen as a legitimate minority group struggling to attain their rights, acted on that philosophy and inspired others to do so. And Frank always said, wrap yourself in the American flag. There's actually a literal photograph of Frank wrapped in the American flag. And he would talk about both, his experience fighting on the front lines in Germany. And in his petition to the Supreme Court, he referred over and over to the Constitution, to the Bill of Rights, to the Declaration of Independence. And so, yes, I think it's very fitting to be writing now about his life in the name of Patrick Henry. So, anyhow, given all Frank's contributions, he laid the groundwork, and as the saying goes, and the rest is history. Thank you for coming and listening, and I wish you all a good evening.
Maybe we have time for one or two questions for David, but I also want to mention that any of the students who are here are invited to join us. We'll be hosting a little dinner with David that's right downstairs in the faculty lounge. There will be a nice buffet, so come and join us for more conversation. So if people have do you want to take one question maybe? What awesome question.
Don't be shy. Hi.
What got you interested in studying the history, not of just Frank, but of the LGBT movement in general?
Excuse me. Well, I mean, first of all, I just like to think of myself as a writer. I think that word covers many sins. And I became a writer rather late in life with no real preparation or conscious preparation. What happened was that I was looking for, because I had no preparation or training, I was looking for a way to get the toe in the water. And a friend connected me with a book company, and I was told that becoming a copy editor at a publishing house was the way to start. So I studied up on copy editing and brushed up my grammar and punctuation and applied. But it so happened this company that I applied to, they were the premier publisher of multicultural books, as we said in the 90s, for young adults. And I'd always had, from my own career as an activist back in Wisconsin, in the back of my mind, the plight of youth, who had trouble getting information. And often, back in that day, gay organizations were often afraid to reach out to youth because normal psychotherapy, you encourage a person to act on their feelings, but in Wisconsin, being homosexual sex was a felony, so if an adult told somebody under 18 you should act on your feelings, they might be charged with, what would be the word? Undermining youth's morals. So when I saw the amazing range of books they published about African American figures, Hispanic figures, they covered Indian tribes, I thought, wow, what if there was something like this for gay people? So I suggested they publish such a series and also a series of biographies, and they took me up on the suggestion. And so it was just kind of always something there, I guess, coming as an interest out of my activism. It was just, I'd always been interested in gay history. Actually, what made me a gay activist in the beginning was reading gay history. Because when I came out my freshman year of college and started buying gay periodicals when I could to keep up with what was going on, and it seemed like every time I opened a magazine back then, some city or county had passed a gay rights law. So being young and naive, I thought, well, it's just going to go on like this, and very soon we'll have all our rights. And then I picked up an underground newspaper in Atlanta, Georgia, and there was a review for a book called The Early Homosexual Emancipation Movement. I think it was the first gay history book published in the U.S. And that told the story of how the movement began in Germany in the late 19th century, became a huge national movement. It was an issue in national elections like today in Germany. The movement got wiped out by World War I. It got going again, and you had people like Hermann Hesse and Albert Einstein signing petitions for gay rights. And then it got wiped out by the Nazis, and they put gay people in the worst concentration camps. And when the Allies liberated the camps, the only group they left behind in the camps were the homosexuals, because under Allied laws, homosexuals were also criminals, just like under Nazi law. And the German government would not pay reparations to the homosexuals who were in the Nazi camps. So that showed me that you can be making splendid progress and something can come along and stop it. So when Anita Bryant came along and overturned the law in Miami, and then another city, I guess I had a messiah complex, but I thought, I got to stop this. So I became a gay activist. I'm sorry, that's a long answer to a short question. Can we take one more?
Is there one more question?
Did you ever meet the guy who pied Anita Bryant in the face?
No, I did not meet her. But I will say, I tried to be very honorable during that campaign, because there was a lesbian in Madison whose mother was one of the main opponents, I think, of Anita Bryant. And they didn't want it known that this person who pushed gay rights in Miami had a lesbian daughter, because they thought it could be used effectively to say, see, you support queer rights, your children can't turn queer. Because that was kind of what Anita Bryant was saying, that this is vampire theory. And so, but they also had, somehow this woman I knew in Madison had Anita Bryant's home phone number, and she gave it to me. And I managed to resist the temptation to misuse that. So I tried to live an honorable life.
Thank you so much.